Welcome to the F4 Clean Fuels slides. These are a follow-up to an earlier piece I made giving an overview on how to decarbonize the global economy. I chose to focus on clean fuels in this follow-up because I believe they are at an absolutely critical inflection point. They're really ready to take off and make a huge impact, but this is a really important time for well-designed policy, targeted innovation, and corporate procurement to support them to accelerate as fast as we can. For more information on all of this analysis, please see f4blog.org. And with that, let's jump into the slides. This is the table of contents for these slides. The first section is going to cover why we need clean fuels, why we have no alternative to clean fuels for decarbonizing some parts of the global economy. The second section is going to cover our clean fuel options. That's clean hydrogen, biofuels, electrofuels, and other types that are going to be critical for addressing these needs. And the third section, which gives a hint to some of the challenges that we'll talk about in section 2, the third section covers how to cut costs, which are the really critical barrier right now to wider, faster clean fuel adoption. Now, a couple of definitions I want to start with. I'm defining clean fuel as a fuel that over its entire life cycle from production to use is carbon neutral or carbon negative. Many fossil fuel industry sources try to justify all kinds of other definitions of clean fuels, and I feel those are shameless marketing. And then carbon neutral, we'll go into more detail in defining this a little bit later, but it is that if a fuel has carbon, that carbon was captured from the atmosphere or from ecosystems. And just two final points. This briefing assumes a core knowledge of climate science and technology. It means to be beginner accessible, but if there's anything here you're not familiar with, I would recommend looking at the earlier slides I made that provide a full overview of how climate change works and the broad summary of solution areas. And then finally, numbers in here are subject to change. These ones are US specific. Prices for all of these vary wildly around the world, and they're going to evolve a lot over time in as fast a growing industry as this one. Let's dive into section 1, why we need clean fuels, covering the parts of the economy that cannot decarbonize in any other way. So this slide starts off with a US share of final energy chart. And this comes from the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory, studying the final energy use across the United States. NREL assessed 19% of final energy demand in 2016 is served by electricity, running on power from grids or off-grid sources. It also assessed 22% of final energy demand as running on fuel, but able to switch to electricity by 2050 if we pursue electrification. These are things like passenger cars, switching from gasoline to electric, indoor heating from natural gas to electric heat pumps. So this is looking at all the parts of the economy that could be converted over to electricity. Now, even with those running on electricity, NREL assesses that we will still have 59% of US final energy demand running on fuels by 2050. These are things like large aircraft, which need very high power to weight ratios to be able to fly, or steel making, which need very high temperatures to be able to function. So even in a situation of high electrification, NREL's judgment is that we will still have most of final energy demand only able to run on fuels even by 2050. Now, there is some variation in the exact numbers here, depending on whether you look at final energy demand or original energy generation, but the point remains that a huge amount of economic activity will still be fuel dependent well into the future. And what are the implications there? The problem is that when we look at available decarbonization routes, we have a path forward in electricity. Electricity is being steadily decarbonized as renewables and energy storage get cheaper and cheaper and more reliable. They're inexorably pushing forward, and we have a path. There's still a lot of challenges we need to overcome, but we have a path to the full decarbonization of our power grids. But That means even if we get all the way there, the fact that we have most of final energy demand not served by electricity even in 2050 means that we are going to need clean fuels to fill that gap. Even if we get perfect renewable electricity and storage, there are things that will not be able to run on the electric grid, which means that we have no choice except for clean fuels to be able to serve these applications. Without clean fuels, there is no way for us to reach net zero emissions across a modern economy. Now that we've covered why we need clean fuels, let's look at the fuels that these are going to replace. And this is a look at 2019 use of fuels for transport, industry, anything that was not for electricity generation. And this makes it pretty easy because 90% of that demand was fed by two fuels, oil and gas. So we're going to focus in on those and what could replace those in the rest of these slides. Now, why are oil and gas so useful? They are useful because they are packed with hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are molecules made out of hydrogen and carbon. Those bonds contain a huge amount of energy, so when these molecules are burned, they release all of that energy, making them really, really useful. Example hydrocarbons are methane, ethane, propane, benzene, kerosene. There are dozens more. Oil and gas are packed with many types. So for instance, gas is mostly methane, but also has other light molecules. It's a gas because it contains light molecules. Oil tends to contain kerosene and other molecules in that heavier end of the range, and that's why it's a liquid at red room temperature. Those fuels get these hydrocarbons from life. Fossil fuels are made when life that lived hundreds of millions of years ago, plants and plankton, other animals, sink to the bottom of oceans, get compressed into the ground as tectonic plates and the ground move, compressed under intense heat and pressure, and the biological molecules that store their energy get turned into hydrocarbons, which then we extract. Now those molecules contain all of that energy that was stored in the creatures, but also all of their carbon. Today, we mainly get hydrocarbons by extracting fossil fuels, but the thing is, it's not just that we could replace hydrocarbons, we also can get hydrocarbons from non-fossil fuel sources. And the rest of these slides, the next section especially, are going to dive into what routes we could take to get clean hydrocarbons and what other fuels we could use to replace hydrocarbons entirely if we want to. This is the table of contents for the next section of these slides, our clean fuel options. And it's going to make the case that we have the technology to build a clean fuel economy at our fingertips already, but we need to keep improving and scaling up production on a vast scale. This is what I'm going to call the fuel menu, analyzing the different fuel options that we have over the next several slides across a couple of different categories. The first is carbon emitting fuels versus carbon neutral fuels. Carbon emitting fuels add to the total amount of carbon in our atmosphere by taking carbon out from Earth's interior and dumping it into the air where it contributes to climate change. Carbon neutral fuels, if they contain carbon, that carbon is captured from already being in circulation, so it has no net effect on climate change. The second category I'd like to divide these on are hydrocarbon fuels, which we've talked about, versus non-carbon fuels. So fossil fuels are the definitive entry for the carbon-emitting hydrocarbon quadrant of this chart. They're carbon that is in permanent storage until we take it out and dump it into the atmosphere. And the next three sections are going to be covered in the following slides. The first quadrant I'd like to dive further into is the carbon-emitting non-carbon fuel quadrant. And what's in here are hydrogen and ammonia derived from natural gas. Today, most hydrogen is produced from natural gas, mainly from the methane within that natural gas. Methane is CH4, subjected to intense heat combined with steam. That hydrogen can be split off, and then the carbon is allowed to combine with atmospheric oxygen and emitted as CO2. And then following that process where you get that gas-derived hydrogen, you can then combine it with atmospheric nitrogen to create ammonia. Now, why are these made? Both of these molecules are critical industrial feedstocks. Hydrogen is used across many heavy industries, including steelmaking, oil refining, a lot of other processes, while ammonia is core for artificial fertilizer and global agriculture. There is a case to be made that ammonia has single-handedly been one of the biggest discoveries in terms of increasing global human agricultural output and the amount of population and prosperity that farming is able to sustain around the world. Now, they're both non-carbon fuels because the molecules don't contain any carbon, so when they're used, no carbon is emitted. However, because they're derived from natural gas and because carbon is emitted during that process, they fall within this carbon-emitting category. These are widely produced globally today, and they are very carbon intensive. Fortunately, there are non-carbon ways to get these fuels, and for that, let's look at the carbon neutral, non-carbon fuels quadrant. And this is where we have green hydrogen and green ammonia. These can be produced, same molecules, all new zero carbon supply chain. They are made with electrolyzer machines, which can take water, H2O, and renewable electricity, and they split the water apart into hydrogen and then oxygen, which gets released. And from that hydrogen, you can either use it or you can convert it into clean ammonia in turn. Now, these answer a couple of really important purposes. For one, they can replace all of the fossil-derived hydrogen and ammonia that are used across the world today. Now, if we want to take them beyond that and replace other current uses of fossil fuels, we would need to build new infrastructure, which is not necessarily that hard. The US does have 3,000 miles of hydrogen pipelines today, but they're located in key industrial areas, while the US has over 1 million miles of natural gas pipelines because those go throughout the entire country to individual homes all over the place. So it's not a question of what's possible, it's more a question of what's cost effective in terms of how much to scale these up. Now, a second point is that hydrogen and ammonia can be a really effective tag team. Now, hydrogen is powerful. It's actually got much more energy by weight than any fossil fuel, but it is hard to transport and use with current infrastructure. So again, you would need to build upgraded infrastructure to be able to distribute hydrogen everywhere if you wanted to, in theory, use it across the entire economy. Now, green ammonia is much less powerful, but it's much easier to work with. Like oil, it is a liquid in the conditions within a pipeline, and so that makes it far simpler than hydrogen to transport. So their idea is to produce green hydrogen, convert it into green ammonia for transport, either use it on the other end or convert it back into hydrogen for use. A lot of proposals like that. These two can work better together than they can individually. But even with these working together, as I alluded to, it might not make a lot of logistical sense to try to convert entire economies over to green hydrogen and green ammonia. For things that will work within existing networks, then we're looking at the carbon neutral hydrocarbon category, which sounds contradictory, but there is some really exciting stuff here, including electrofuels. And these they come under a lot of different names. They're known as e-fuels, syn-fuels. There are many different approaches to making them. The variant I'm focusing on here are those that are made from combining clean hydrogen and captured carbon to create synthetic clean hydrocarbon molecules. So by this process, for instance, you can make synthetic kerosene that is exactly the same as kerosene taken out of a fossil fuel. The only difference is that this one is being made from fresh, clean hydrogen and from captured carbon that was already in circulation, while fossil kerosene was made from dead plankton that has been underground for hundreds of millions of years and is now having its carbon dumped into the atmosphere. So there's a lot of appeal to electrofuels. And one of the biggest sales pitch elements of this is that they could be an easy drop-in replacement for fossil fuels. Since these hydrocarbons are the exact same, electrofuels could, in theory, just be put straight into existing pipelines, fuel tanks, other infrastructure. Unlike green hydrogen and green ammonia, deploying electrofuels across entire economies would not need custom infrastructure development and investment. The real core question is just getting enough electrofuel produced that can then be put into the supply chain. Now, that comes with a caveat because electrofuels are really electricity intensive to make. And green hydrogen itself is already pretty electricity intensive to make. So to make this a viable option, we are going to need a vast amount of clean electricity. And we're also going to need a source of captured carbon, which, as I covered in my first set of slides, that's a technology that's still being developed. And even once those are fully developed, they're going to need to be massively scaled up in order to produce a lot of electrofuels. So what other options can we add to this carbon neutral hydrocarbon quadrant to support electrofuels, given that those are going to take time to develop? The core one to talk about here is biofuels. And I'm laughing because these get really, really controversial. So to start off, biofuels are any energy carrying molecules that are extracted from crops, from waste, from other biomatter. The controversy really comes in when you start talking about what types of biofuels we should be using. And there are huge distinctions that are very important between current biofuels that are dominant in the market today and the ones that we should be relying on in the future. Because the currently dominant fuels, if you look at total volume, that is mainly ethanol. Now, ethanol is produced by growing corn, sugarcane, other crops, and making it into a gasoline additive. And for many reasons, which if you're interested, I encourage you to dive into the citations and the sources. For many reasons, it is actually not environmentally clean, and it is not a sustainable fuel to rely on in the long run. So I am not personally a fan of ethanol. Sorry to Iowa. Then there's biogas, which is kind of in this middle ground of somewhat mature today, still scaling up. That relies on waste. So agricultural waste and other biomaterial that bacteria can process and digest, emitting biogas, mainly methane, which can then be used as fuel. And that is a very promising technology, can be really effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions because it takes methane that would otherwise just go into the air and uses it as a fuel. However, the total amount of waste biofuel that can be produced is capped by the fact that it relies on waste. And there's only so much waste in the world that could be converted to fuels. And to replace the world's global fossil fuel demand, there just is not nearly enough waste to be able to cover all of that. So we need to find new biofuels that can produce larger amounts of production without relying on waste as the feedstock. Now, if we can do that, and the way we can do that, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail in this piece, but there's a lot of really promising ideas out there. If we can do that, biofuels have the potential to be great drop-in replacements. So existing biofuels actually do need to be refined or used in limited blends. For instance, if you compare natural gas and biogas, they are similar, but biogas has some more organic molecules that need to be filtered out if you're going to run an engine that's used to natural gas on biogas. So there is a purification process, which adds a bit to cost. But with more R&D or with further development of other biofuel production methods, we could turn them into direct hydrocarbon substitutes, which would give the same appeal as electrofuels in being able to just put biologically derived fuels directly into the infrastructure that we currently use for fossil fuels. With that, let's sum up where we are now. This is the final fuel menu. Our options for decarbonizing human fuel use involve replacing fossil fuels with clean hydrocarbon fuels and replacing them with clean non-carbon fuels. Obviously, these are not separate options. These are going to go together, and every different industry, every different region is going to have to use a different blend of these options. Now, there are a couple key clarifications that I made the next few slides to go through. First, how are these fuels carbon neutral if they contain carbon? I know I've been talking through individually as we go through these slides, how that works, but I made a slide that summarizes how that functions to go through it in more detail and hopefully answer any remaining questions that you have. The second point is, how about using carbon capture to stop emitting CO2? That is a great question, and 2 slides from now, we're going to go through that in detail. All right, this next chart is going to walk through how net carbon emissions work. And I want to say up front that the original Freedom from Fossil Fuels slide deck has much more detail on this. So if you'd like to go and get the full briefing, I do recommend going back to that. But for our purposes here, we can summarize it this way. Carbon in the atmosphere impacts Earth's climate. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. The more greenhouse gas there is, the more heat is absorbed into Earth's atmosphere. Now, I say here that atmosphere and the surface can be considered part of one system because they're constantly exchanging carbon. Carbon dioxide is going down into ocean water. It's being absorbed by plants and then re-emitted when they die. So adding carbon to either system, it's kind of like adding water to one side of a swimming pool. The water is going to go spread out the same level, no matter where you put it originally. And so if you add carbon to either one of these, the net result is there will be more carbon in the atmosphere and Earth's climate will get warmer. Now, Earth's interior can be considered a carbon safe zone, a lockbox. Carbon there is stored within rocks, within fossil fuels. There's a huge amount there, and it does not impact the climate. It's safely locked away. There is a bit of carbon exchange between the interior and the surface through carbon comes up through volcanoes, goes back down through weathering, but that natural process is far, far slower than human fossil fuel emissions. So for the purposes of this analysis, we can consider that effectively a permanent barrier. We can assume there's no natural exchange because compared to fossil fuel use, it's a minuscule amount. Speaking of human fossil fuel use, let's look at what that does effectively. So fossil fuels are taking carbon buried in Earth's interior and dumping it into the atmosphere with high net carbon dioxide emissions and acceleration of climate change. Now, if we use things like biofuels, that's a very different picture. And this gets confusing because people hear about biofuels being burned and say, well, isn't that carbon that's being put into the atmosphere just like for fossil fuels? And the key difference is that for biofuels, all of that carbon was drawn out of the atmosphere into those organisms. So when we burn that carbon, we are just re-emitting it to where it already was. It's a closed cycle. This is carbon that was taken out of circulation and is now being returned to circulation. So that has a neutral effect on total carbon dioxide and on climate change. Whereas fossil fuels are taking carbon that was out of circulation and dumping it into circulation. So increasing the total carbon in the atmosphere surface system. So electrofuels, as long as they're made using carbon that was captured from the atmosphere or from the surface, are the same thing. They are having a net neutral impact on climate. And then finally, green hydrogen and ammonia are only on this chart to keep the others company. They're irrelevant here because they do not have any carbon involved. Now let's see what carbon capture does when added to this chart. And I will say for the record, I know these are getting really complicated, but it took me a few days just to be able to get it to this state where they could be put into 2 slides. So if anyone has suggestions for how this could be made visually clear, please let me know. I would love to hear it and put out a new version. But this chart shows where the last slide ended off. Now let's take that fossil fuels bar and add carbon capture and storage and look at what that does. So that will return some, but not all, of the emitted carbon back to the interior. Now it's some, because this is not 100% effective. It's unclear if it will ever be possible to make it 100% effective. And the pilot plants that are trying to prove this at large scale right now, please look in the sources for specific cases, but they are very, very far from 100% effective. So unless there is a fundamental change in what we can expect out of carbon capture technology, any use of fossil fuels is always going to be adding net carbon to the atmosphere. There is no way around that problem, and there is no way for fossil fuels to become a clean fuel if that remains true. Now, it's a different story when we look at biofuels and electrofuels. Because those fuels' carbon was already in circulation in the atmosphere and surface system, then any carbon captured and stored from those fuels is taking carbon out of circulation. It is a net negative emission. And that is a potentially transformative tool in our ability to address climate change that the next slide is going to dive into in more detail. This next chart will cover why that is so potentially powerful. And if you'd like more detail on the facts behind the chart on the left here, I would recommend going back to f4blog.org and the original Freedom from Fossil Fuels slide deck, because that has several slides that dive into how this works. But the core point here is that the pace of climate change is not set by our annual rate of emissions. It is set by the total elevated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Even if somehow we were able to cut our net emissions to zero tomorrow, climate change would just keep rolling, because the core problem is that in the pre-industrial era, there were 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and today there are over 410. That gap of 130 and counting is what is driving climate change. So what can clean fuels do about that? Just by switching over from fossil fuels to clean fuels can help slash our net emissions to zero. And that is really important. That is our first step, because at least that is going to stop widening that gap and stop making climate change worse. However, what happens next is the really exciting possibility, because if we combine a global clean fuel economy with mass scale carbon capture, that can be the tool that drives mass carbon dioxide removal to cut that gap down and reverse climate change. Fundamentally, climate change will not end until we eliminate that gap, until we pull Earth's atmosphere back to 280 parts per million carbon dioxide. And if we can adopt clean fuels globally, we will be partway to a solution that is capable of delivering that. All right, and with that, we have one more complicated chart to go through to look at how this transition phase could work. So on the left column, this is energy today. Carbon is moving from the interior into fossil fuels, and then from the surface and atmosphere into clean fuels. And then when any of those fuels, fossil or clean, are burned, that carbon is going to the surface and atmosphere. So for the clean fuels, that effect is neutral. And for fossil fuels, the effect is net emissions to the atmosphere, which is unsustainable. So how can we get past that and build a sustainable global economy? In the transitional phase, what we need to do is decrease our share of fossil fuel use and increase our share of clean fuel use. At the same time, we need to be attaching carbon capture wherever it is feasible. And what that means is that the more carbon we capture, the more it can be recycled into new clean fuels or put into the interior. Now, at the beginning phases, we're not going to be able to get to net negative here. We won't have the scale yet, but we'll at least be able to mitigate the emissions that are still coming out of fossil fuels into the atmosphere. We'll be building up for the final phase. And that final phase will be on the right here. A global economy with only clean fuels that has an increasing share of carbon capture to recycle the carbon from that clean fuel use either into new clean fuels or to put it into the interior. So this means if we take this approach, that human civilization will be on a ramp. The further along we go, the lower we will get our net emissions at first. And then once we hit a critical pivot point, the higher and higher our net negative emissions will become, putting us on the road to ending climate change. Finally, this slide concludes this section with an overview of what we've talked about and where human civilization can go from here. We've talked about the chart on the left. We've talked about the options on the right. What's added here is option C, below the chart, using hydrocarbon fuels with carbon capture. Now, I'd like to repeat once again that any use of fossil fuels, even with carbon capture, will have net carbon emissions. So there is no way that fossil fuel use can be sustainable in the long run. There is no way to make a clean fossil fuel. There's a reason why this series is called Freedom from Fossil Fuels. And after reading a lot of great sources on both sides many sides of a very complicated debate, given that we don't currently have the tools to replace fossil fuels globally just yet, I'm okay with investment in carbon capture technology being deployed with fossil fuels right now, but I believe that it all should be in the long-term vision of a global clean fuel economy that uses carbon capture to go carbon negative. And I do recommend reading through sources here because there is a lot of debate. There are those who argue that carbon capture with fossil fuels can be a long-term solution. There are those who argue that fossil fuel use combined with large-scale direct air capture could make sense. I personally believe that it does not make any financial sense for that to be the long-term solution. I think that clean fuels are going to be the most cost-effective option in the long run, and that carbon capture will be a tool to take them negative to end climate change. But there are many different perspectives out there. So that concludes this section. The next section is going to go into what it would take to implement this clean fuel vision of humanity's future. And I was actually surprised when I researched this all. I was expecting more technical barriers that we had not figured out yet. And what I found out is that we actually know how to do most of this. We have the technology. It'll take a lot of work, a lot of new infrastructure, but the only fundamental remaining barrier is lowering